Pirates are probably one of the most famous historical jobs you can have, if you can really call it a job. But they kind of sucked, despite this also being something that has persisted from ancient times, even to today. Now here's a pretty big reason why pirates sucked. I'm going to start on living conditions, and I'll be going back to these later. But basically, pirate ships sucked. They were mainly wooden, meaning they would very easily rot in the rain. I think that's how that works, at least. And they couldn't build their own. Most pirates had little to no training. They would often have to find an alone merchant ship, hoping it was unguarded, nab it, and even then, they're not built for fighting, so if you did have to fight, good luck. And they'd have to be modified to put cannons in. Now, so you got a merchant 1700 ship with little to no safety, mold, and very few food options, as most things would spoil. And even then, most ships were very crowded to keep manpower up. Now, another thing is fighting, which I'm going to get on more now. Pirates wouldn't be doing backflips or swinging around ropes. Usually, fights would go one of two ways. If on a merchant ship, most of them would surrender. If they didn't surrender, then an ongoing battle would be pretty horrific because you're a bunch of untrained merchants with a bunch of money versus a bunch of pirate barbarians. And generally, the pirate barbarians could scare someone into surrendering loot, even if they were not good at fighting. Against a much larger ship built for fighting, though, then most pirates would lose against stronger foes with more training. For example, two pirate republics, one in Nassau and one on Gotland that I'll get in a minute. In Nassau, in the Bahamas, there was a group that was able to last in gold from raiding merchant ships, bribing the government to not tell anyone else that they were there. But eventually, a British fleet decided to end the malarkey, and the pirates stood no chance and were unable to hold the island. Now, not all pirates were a few years, as I mentioned earlier. There was the one in Gotland, led by the Victual brothers, who were a bunch of German and Scandinavian pirates that held out for nearly 50 years. But then they were originally nobles who actually were focused on trade in the region, and they would end up gaining commoners in their ranks and eventually resorting to piracy due to the many trade ships in the Hanseatic League. They would end up joining a war, though at their peak they would join a war between Denmark and Sweden, joining the Swedes as mercenaries to stop the Danes from taking Stockholm. But from there they would go back to piracy for a little while, until the Hanseatic League would end up stopping them, and they would be severely weakened, but they would last for another 50 years or so. Now, a reason I brought up these republics is outside of how different they turned out, is supplies. You see, the average person needs these things called food and water. I don't get it personally, but whatever, you do you. When you're a bunch of criminal outlaws, the average person, the government's not exactly going to give you food. The republics that I mentioned had them, and had supplies, food and water, and even then still life sucked. So imagine having a limited supply of food, and having to fight for every last bit of it. And even then, it's only ship food. Most other foods would spoil outside of something like hardtack. And if you tried raiding an island, it would probably not last very long. There are also a lot of diseases that affected pirates, such as scurvy, which led to a lot of bleeding in the gums and then killed you. And there were a few others as well. But the main takeaway from today should be that the majority of being a pirate was sitting below deck in a cramped, moldy room with rats running around with little food and water, while your crew all have deadly diseases. And then occasionally you would go out and fight for a few minutes, only to go back to deck and die of a now preventable illness. Would not recommend being a pirate.